Thank you, TJ and Lori, for inviting me, and Rachel for making everything possible here. It's a great honor to be back at Santa Cruz, where I was a student in the mid-1990s. It's beautiful here and still as dynamic intellectually and politically as ever. Well, so it's clear by now that business as usual can't sustain. From both radical and mainstream thinkers and media, we are told that we're at the end of something. The end of cheap something is a favorite topic, the end of cheap labor, cheap energy, cheap food. Usually this conversation around the end of something, and also of the costs of doing something about climate and so many other expressions of planetary crisis, turns on scarcity. On the one hand, we're told that we're running out of X, Y, Z, you name it. On the other hand, we're told that the only solution to these problems that doesn't involve a massive reduction in living standards is technological. Well, technology, of course, becomes the cure for scarcity, or the cure for, say, climate crisis that will induce scarcity. For instance, through climate-smart agriculture now, Monsanto tells us, will save the planet. More and more of the old medicine. So right away, we have two big problems. One has to do with the meaning of scarcity, the other with the history of technology. So the two issues are, of course, deeply entwined, although not always obviously. And I want to begin with a focus on the grand thinker of scarcity in the modern world, Thomas Malthus. But first, I want us to keep in mind something crucial about how technology in the modern world works. First, I want to remind you that technologies embody and perform a civilization's dominant relations of power, capital, and nature. That is, its model of power, capital, and nature, what I've called a world ecology. In the history of the modern world, the truly epoch-making technologies have been, yes, about making profit, and only secondarily about helping social ills. We all know this. But there's a deeper valence to modern technology. The epoch-making technologies of the modern world have been about mobilizing the unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies, to use the words of Maria Mies, beyond capital, but necessary to capital's survival. These technologies are above all, these epoch-making technologies of the modern world that have fixed the recurrent crises of capitalism are above all frontier technologies. The cartographic, scientific, financial, and shipbuilding revolutions of early capitalism occurred through global conquest. The steam engine developed at the pit heads of coal mines and could only be refined where the energy of these subterranean Americas was cheapest. The global railroad and steamship revolution later that coal and empire made possible were in turn profitable because they extended capital's steely tentacles into heartlands of peasant and indigenous societies across the planet. The automobile and petrochemical revolutions of the 20th century, too, found their enabling conditions in subterranean Americas, in liquefied gel of ancient zooplankton oil. So when we are told that capitalist technology will resolve scarcity or promote sustainability, we need to be skeptical. For capitalist technology has a demonstrable track record of 5 centuries with two inescapable facts. Unprecedented violence towards humans and the rest of nature in the name of progress. Unprecedented waste, not accidental inefficiency, but unprecedented waste committed to ever-rising levels of energy and material intensity relative to human labor power. If the idea of nature as external and controllable and indeed full of many humans, that is, the category, the real abstraction of nature in the modern world has been full of humans who were expelled from humanity, indigenous peoples, women, Africans, many others, that this is a legacy of early capitalism, the idea of nature as the source of scarcity and the problem of scarcity outside of history emerges towards the end of the 18th century. The removal of history from our thinking about nature intrudes into our everyday languages. We all know this. It's natural to feel this way. This happens naturally. We all know this with our students and in activist politics as well. You know, there's the question of human nature. There is a removal of history from our thinking about these questions that I think is at the core of Malthusian thought. That they all of these, for all of their diversity, they share something in common. They remove this history from human behavior. They remove history from the web of life. Well, the idea of nature as external to history has indeed, since Adam Smith, favored a view of the economy as a timeless logic of rationality and efficiency. And this is very much with us. The great Larry Summers said, you know, the laws of economics are just like the laws of nature. They're timeless. We just have to get them right. He's still working on it, apparently. For modern environmentalists, there's a similar problem. Nature is timeless. The problem has often been put just as bluntly. Consider Paul Ehrlich's 1968 The Population Bomb, whose 1971 cover was adorned with a cartoon bomb containing a baby and endorsed by the Sierra Club. Like Malthus, Ehrlich sounded the alarm of rising population, only more emphatically. The battle to feed all of humanity is over, he said. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions will starve to death. And surveying how did we get here, he says, well, it all happened a very long time ago. Indeed, billions of years of evolution produced the present hunger crisis. So this is an eternalizing of nature. So environmentalist thinking has often challenged this, but I would say the majority across the political spectrum, unfortunately, is drawn deeply from this eternalist well. And this leads to a thinking about limits as outside and social relations as inside. There are natural limits and social limits. And this is something that seems to cut across the mainstream and radical divide, especially in some of the social sciences like American sociology. Right-wing economists could speak to capitalism's technological ingenuity. They could highlight the internal capacity to revise external limits. Reformers could point to modest track records of solving environmental problems through regulation. And some radical ecologists would, of course, begin to see human extinction as the only answer to the world's ecological problems. And I think that the left has done a poor job in dealing, historical materialism in particular, has really never been able to follow through on filling in two great lacunae in this system of thought. One is the question of human population, and one is the question of nature. And although those have been explored in many ways, the historical dimension of this remains sorely lacking. And so for all their political disagreements, everyone converged on the essence, I think, of the Malthusian argument, that the limits to growth were indeed external and inscribed in the laws of nature. I think that the Anthropocene in its popular discourse is a version of this argument, and we need to attend very carefully to the kind of stealth Malthusianism that creeps into environmentalist discourse at every level. Well, in the 2 centuries since Malthus's first essay appeared in 1798, a fierce struggle has been waged over how to think about the relationship between the economy and nature. The Malthusian position is straightforward. Human population is governed by geometric increase, 2 times 2 times 2, and so on. Nature's fertility is governed by arithmetic increase, 2 plus 2 plus 2. So you see the eternalizing of nature here. And in this perspective, neither human nor extra-human natures have any history. They are instead governed by these natural, eternal logics of life without history. Well, critics of Malthus, radical and conservative both, argued that the logics are historical and subject to considerable variation. The classic critique of Malthus, of course, came from Marx, and he argued that human population dynamics were highly variable. Every great era of capitalism is shaped by special laws of population, something that only a few scholars have really picked up and tried to explore. Equally variable, it turns out, was nature's so-called carrying capacity, a shining gem in the neo-Malthusian lexicon. The dynamism of capitalism, something Malthus underemphasized but which Marx understood well, owes everything to modern agriculture's extraordinary capacity to produce more and more food with less and less work. That agricultural model is now under siege and is likely to pass from the scene very soon. So on closer inspection, Malthus's iron laws of population look much more plastic, flexible, historical. And I think the point can't be said often enough, that limits for one civilization, limits for one era of civilization are not necessarily limits for the other, that the limits are historical and the apparently outside and the apparently inside are knitted together. The question is, how are they knitted together? What are the historical and geographical patterns around that? And how do we know when those patterns are coming unraveled? That is, when do we see crisis? How do we know crisis when we see one, and what kind of crisis is it? If we are living in an era of capitalism's developmental crisis, that is one of a long series of crises, such as I'll talk about in just a moment, at the end of the 18th century. So if we are living at essentially a hiccup in the system, albeit a big one, then the politics are much different than if we are living through a fundamental breakdown of capitalism as a system of wealth, power, and nature, such as we saw in feudal Europe in the middle of the 14th century. Now, one of the things that's happened is that the medieval crisis that really reaches a boiling point with the Black Death between 1347 and 1352 is so often narrated as a Malthusian crisis. This is absolutely 100% false. Not because it didn't have something to do with population densities, but because it's an abstract and eternal explanation for a deeply historical and conjunctural affair. That the demise of feudalism was not inevitable, but was indeed an unusual socio-physical conjuncture of climate change, of the rising demands of feudal lords, of the underinvestment in and the locking into a grain system of cultivation by peasants in Central and Western Europe, and above all, by the peasants' refusal to acquiesce to the imposition of new repressive labor legislation beginning in the heart of the Black Death. So, in other words, feudalism comes to an end not because of some terrible Malthusian crisis, but because population, class, and power are all inextricably linked up with particular sets of ecological relationships, of biophysical relationships. And it is how they are all fit together that began to break down. And so we need to be very skeptical when we see Jared Diamond types trotting out the supposedly rigorous historical stories of Malthusian crisis. They are rarely so, certainly not in the case of medieval Europe. But we've also seen developmental crises, that is, great eras of global restructuring, of dispossession, of colonialism, of industrialization that seek to reestablish the conditions for long waves of capital accumulation. Now, Malthus, of course, wrote during one of these developmental crises. We don't normally think of the era of the Industrial Revolution as one of these, but it absolutely was. Indeed, per capita food consumption in England falls between 1750 and 1800. So between the 1760s and 1820s, not just England, but capitalism as a whole, experienced the exhaustion of the older model of power, capital, and nature that had dominated in the centuries after 1492. England's first agricultural revolution had run its course by the 1760s. Agricultural productivity slowed dramatically, food prices skyrocketed. The birth rate, meanwhile, had risen by 50% between the end of the 17th century, when population growth was around zero, to 0.9% in the 1770s, 1.5% in 1816. This was because of the emergence of new patterns of family formation as depeasantization and dispossession took hold there. So we have this moment of tremendous ferment, and the reality to Malthus looked very much like his model described. It did indeed look like an era where agricultural productivity had hit some kind of ceiling, and where population growth was indeed skyrocketing. Malthus wasn't stupid, he just didn't get history. He didn't understand that these were historical processes. But that wasn't all. Malthus was deeply afraid. Malthus was, if nothing else, an intellectual of the British ruling class and of the British Empire, from 1805 occupying the East India Company College's first chair of political economy. The first essay appeared in 1798, the most rebellious quarter century that capitalism had known to this point. This was the era of the world revolution of the West, underscored by the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. While these revolutions were all eventually contained, in each radical elements threatened a more fundamental challenge to capitalism. Nor was social unrest limited to these revolutions. In Russia, Pugachev led a peasant rebellion in the 1770s, among whose many grievances was the increasing concentration of land ownership and intensification of serfdom. In colonial Peru, the Tupac Amaru rebellion challenged Spanish rule in the early 1780s, and in 1798, just as Malthus's essay appeared, the Irish revolted. Within England, rising food prices brought with them food riots, insurrections that Malthus and his contemporaries called them, whose frequency sharply accelerated after 1757. It was in England, too, during this time that the word strike first enters our social conflict lexicon. In 1768, sailors shut down London, the world's largest port, when they struck, that is, took down the sails of their vessels, crippling the commerce of the empire's leading city. When sailors struck Liverpool in 1775, the sailors took aim as well at the slave trade. When fired upon by the authorities, they dragged their ships' guns to the center of the city and bombarded the mercantile exchange, leaving scarce a whole pane of glass in the neighborhood, contemporaries wrote. So Malthus had good reason to be worried. And if Malthus's vision would soon be eclipsed, the rebellions and revolutions of the Atlantic world tamed, there was an enduring impact on thinking about population and limits as outside, as external to the contradictions of capitalism. How was this resolved? Well, this developmental crisis of the late 18th century was resolved by yet another new colonialism, yet another wave of exterminism, yet another wave of dispossession. But it worked because clearing the lands that could be used for cheap energy, for cheap raw materials, for cheap food in various ways, clearing the lands of indigenous peoples through extermination and dispossession, bringing in African slaves, establishing new vital zones of industrial agriculture in the American Midwest was an audacious way of acquiring and putting to work the work possibilities of an entire North American continent. So if Malthus's vision was eclipsed to some degree in the 19th and 20th centuries during these two great waves of industrialization that occur, the first based, as we know, on coal and steam, the second, the petrochemical and internal combustion engines and steel revolutions of the post-1870s, it would come up essentially when these great waves of cheap nature had run their course. And when did that happen? Well, it began to happen in the 1970s. This was the birth of what we call neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is an era of capitalism. And it's interesting that just at the moment when as political economists tell us, the rate of profit in American basic industry was beginning to fall in the late 1960s, you have the emergence of a population fear, of a population scare that began to take shape. And I think that ultimately they have to do with a lot of different factors, but we have to look at another wave of worldwide popular revolt, anti-colonial revolt, but also class revolt. That this developmental crisis of the 1970s, when we see a boom in population thinking associated with Ehrlich, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment, was really this moment of the 1970s was the climax of the anti-colonial revolts and social revolutions across the global South. Vietnamese peasants brought American power to its knees. The Portuguese Empire crumbled in the face of social revolt and military resistance at home and abroad. Chile pursued a short-lived democratic socialist revolution. In the United States, the African-American freedom struggle radicalized beyond initial demands for civil rights, Martin Luther King famously calling for moving and acting beyond Vietnam to confront the interrelated triple evils of the whole society, the problem of racism, the problem of exploitation, and the problem of war. Here was a dangerous program indeed. So these words spoken in the late summer of 1967. The student-led anti-war movement, of course, was growing in numbers and radicalizing. Meanwhile, American workers in the heart of industrial capitalism challenged employers with increasing frequency. Strikes increased sharply, and the number of striking workers more than doubled between 1965 and 1970. More troubling still, rank-and-file workers increasingly challenged their own leaderships, rejected negotiated contracts, and engaged in unauthorized wildcat strikes. In March 1970, for instance, postal workers struck against their employers, against their leaders, and against the law. Nixon declared a national emergency, federalized the National Guard to deliver mail. It didn't work. Guardsmen openly fraternized with the strikers, who quickly won a hefty pay increase. The global order in American society was indeed coming unraveled by an informed and savvy response to capitalism. How bourgeois elites solved this crisis and how we came to live in a neoliberal world is a story that has been told often and well. What I want to underline is the resurgence of Malthusian thinking in this period and returning with a salience in world politics unknown since Malthus's time. So the immediate spur to the Malthusian Renaissance was not scarcity. It was not the commodity boom of 1972 to 75, centered on oil and wheat. The real spur, I think, was global anti-colonial revolution. The post-war era was 18th century's Haiti, Pugachev, Tupac Amaru, globally connected times 10. As in Malthus's time, there was ruling class fear that the envy of the world's poor would lead to the world's poor majority to ask for their share. Indeed, a conflict that has appeared across the neoliberal era, and in particular over the past 20 years in Latin America. That was hardly a trifling matter. The post-war order was premised on an extraordinary resource imbalance. In 1950, 2/3 of world population consumed just 5% of marketed industrial raw materials. As those populations grew over the next 2 decades in the post-war golden age, their politics also began to take seriously the developmentalist promise of Pax Americana and to question that drastic population resource imbalance. The unease seems to have manifested earliest, and not surprisingly, around population growth in the global south. So if you look at the opening pages of Ehrlich's Sierra Club-sponsored population bomb, you can see racial anxiety just dripping off the page. I know that some of you are familiar with this, but he talks about that there was hopping with fleas in his visit to India, that people were everywhere begging and defecating in the streets, and it was dirty and filthy and overwhelming and all of this. So this was it was not hard to decode what was going on here. And while it's true that Ehrlich later apologized for this, I think that the die had been cast. Too many people, too many brown people especially, produced poverty, overcrowding, filth. The New York Times put its official seal on the matter in March 1968 with its editorial announcing that a terrible Malthusian nightmare lay in our future unless immediate action was taken. And this would lead to Ehrlich's fellow travelers like Colin Vaux saying quite bluntly, ecology's first social law should be written. All poverty is caused by the continued growth of population. Well, reading Ehrlich, one assumes that population growth in post-war India was unprecedented and unusual. It was not. Growth in India, as elsewhere, was indeed robust on a world scale. It was about 2% annually in the 50s and 60s. American growth in this same period clocked in at about 1.5% a year, so lower, but not that much lower. And indeed, India's population growth was at precisely the global average. By way of contrast, American population in its demographic explosion, that is in the 19th century, grew between 5 and 6 times faster than the global average during this 19th century. And for more than a century grew 30% faster than India during India's population boom. So to be sure, Ehrlich, like Malthus 2 centuries earlier, was not mistaken about population growth as such. But also, like Malthus, Ehrlich could only think in terms of numbers. And here again we see some corollaries to the Anthropocene conversation. The history was always a secondary consideration. And indeed, population growth on a planetary scale has slowed sharply since 1970 to 1.5% over the post-1970 period to just 1% over the past decade. Indeed, population growth slowed by 44% over the past half century, and world fertility continues to fall. So environmentalist and public concern over human numbers has ebbed and flowed since then. In the decade after 1968, I think we see the linkage of the population and the environment and the idea of natural limits, of external limits taking shape. Perhaps nowhere more clearly than in the, I think, the classic and still useful book in many respects by Donella Meadows and her colleagues, The Limits to Growth. And the limits in this account were not limits that emerged out of social contradictions, out of contradictions of power and production and reproduction, but over how the world system, in their words, acted upon an external object, nature. So, like all big ideas, limits enjoyed the virtue of good timing, published at the same year as the 1972 to 75 commodity boom began, and just 2 years before the greatest world economic crisis, that of 1974 to 75, that the world had seen since the Great Depression. And of course, as we know, the extraordinary spike in prices had nothing to do with population and everything to do with geopolitics. The idea of the limits to growth, which was quickly converted into natural limits over the next decade, that stuck. And it was so seductive, and I think that this is a historical example that can be a warning to us in the present, that the seductiveness of neo-Malthusian and natural limits thinking was so powerful that even the great progressive economist Robert Heilbroner joined right-wing Malthusians and eugenicists like Garrett Harding, of Tragedy of the Commons phase, in suggesting that an authoritarian solution to the external challenge, in Heilbroner's words, might be necessary. And so here you have I think you see you see the possibilities in radical catastrophism, which, by the way, is not about an acknowledgement that catastrophes have already begun happening, but radical catastrophism, and I think mainstream technocratic approaches like the technocratic Anthropocene, and a tendency to favor a politics of emergency and to see democracy as somehow beside the point. I think that there is a danger here in that. Well, but this was not just a question about natural limits thinking, and the point that I want to tease out here is that eternalizing the categories of society and nature also leads to a series of violent, both analytically violent, but also practically violent real abstractions around questions of race and gender and class. So by 1970, Ann and Paul Ehrlich had published a widely read textbook in which they called for laws making bearing a third child illegal and that would require an abortion to terminate all such pregnancies. It was surely a bitter pill to swallow in the wake of an American century that had seen the forced sterilization of African American and Puerto Rican and other women of color, and in which a bill during World War II that would have sterilized all Japanese American women under wartime internment failed by a single vote. Indeed, the environmentalism associated with the population bomb, Julian Bond, the civil rights activist, noted in 1970, readily becomes a theoretical hammer in the hands of angry, frightened, and powerful racists. In 1973, 14 states were considering legislation to require women on welfare to undergo sterilization. And then, no surprise from here that nature as external threat readily lent itself to, you guessed it, nativism, anti-immigrant politics, etc. So by 1972, the authors of the best-selling Blueprint for Survival called not only for an end to the industrial way of life, not capitalism, but the industrial way of life, but also for an end to immigration. Well, this specter of neo-Malthusianism has, I think, not really been banished. It retains its extraordinary power today, I think often in stealth form, and I think that it infuses, in some ways fundamentally, the major environmentalist concepts of our times, the Anthropocene and the ecological footprint. This Malthusianism avoids the crass ethnocentrism of previous eras while installing population as the explanatory pivot of ecological crisis thinking. For the Earth system scientists, the human enterprise, amongst the Anthropocene's favorite phrases, is an homage to the Ehrlichs, who popularized the phrase in the early 1990s. And while Anthropocene arguments recognize global inequality, the enduring power relations, not least of imperialism, that created it remain exogenous to their model. Population growth remains central, grounded in some version of the Ehrlichs' too many people, too much consumption perspective. Meanwhile, even many progressive environmentalists have embraced the ecological footprint concept, which seeks to demonstrate the human overshoot of the planet's carrying capacity. So here again, we're back to the eternalization of nature. And in this mode of representing and thinking the global crisis, which is one of humans and the rest of life under capitalist relations of power and production and reproduction, that we see that the footprint thinking enforces a reality that explains things through a hyper-individualism. So students, you can go online, you can have fun with footprints. By monitoring your personal and household consumption, you can calculate your own footprint. And this leads to two big errors tightly linked to the Malthusian worldview. One, it teaches us to think consumption is either more or less, something determined by lifestyle choices rather than socially enforced logics. That is, driving to work is not a personal choice if there's no reasonable transportation alternative. And two, it teaches us to think of the drivers of planetary crisis as grounded in the aggregation of people and consumption, rather than the systemic dynamics of capitalism and empire. And I often cite Donella Meadows and her colleagues reminding us that for every 1 ton of waste in consumption, there is about 20 tons of waste in production. So what's the big problem with such stealth Malthusianism? Well, as you can imagine, I think quite a few problems. I think the defense of this is that it acknowledges the reality of our times, But then Malthus's original pronouncements acknowledged the reality of the times. He just did it in a completely authoritarian and ruling class kind of way. That what's at stake here is how we think about the relations of population, not just of human numbers, although that's important, but also, as we know, non-human animals, especially those encaged within the world's global meat industrial complex of promises to increase non-human animal production from 60 to 120 billion a year over the next decade. Imagine the implications for climate change and everything else around that. All right, so I want to finish the arc of this talk by identifying how our present era bears some striking parallels to the Malthusian era, the developmental crisis of the late 18th century, but it's much different because there are no more frontiers of cheap nature. And what we need to recognize is that not just the industrial model is now in question. Indeed, what we've been seeing for the past 30 years is a pronounced secular slowdown in labor productivity growth, which is the real basis of wealth under capitalism. But more fundamentally, a pronounced stagnation and dramatic slowdown in agriculture's physical productivity and labor productivity. And I'm just going to ask you to take that for granted for a moment. And we can tease out the data if we like. But what we need to look at is that the problems, especially with agriculture, and the reason why we can sit here in this room is because of an agriculture that produces a dramatic surplus, that what we are seeing is not just a problem of resource depletion, not just an end of not enough substances, but also the overflowing of nature as a cheap garbage can. And this is how capital looks at it, of course. And this is above all dramatized in the question of climate and the over-pollution of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that are now feeding back into the core productive processes of capitalism. And no example is more salient than in agriculture, where we already see the yield suppression, this is the agronomist term, the yield suppression effects of ongoing climate change on agriculture in the big four grain crops of the world, of soy, rice, maize, and wheat. And not just that, but rising CO2 concentrations make those grain crops less nutritious. So the Green Revolution, which started that, is now amplified by ongoing climate change. All right, so how do we think of limits, and what's the basis for a politics around that? Well, I think we have to shift from protecting Earth, from protecting things to a proactive strategy that values what? I would say there are many candidates, and I'm going to suggest one as a possible part of a constellation of values, that we need a politics of work that goes beyond the old Marxist and economistic, both mainstream economistic and Marxist economistic versions of what counts as work. Because, of course, capitalism works because most work is not valued. Most work is done off the books, the work of women, nature, and colonies. That's fundamental to how capitalism works. So the processes of what Marx calls the circuit of capital work when they are relatively modest in oceans of cheap or potentially cheap unpaid work, overwhelmingly provided by women, nature, and colonies. So I want to suggest work as one way to carry forth this conversation, not as a master category, but indeed as a point of criticism to transcend the master category of modernity, which is work, or work capital in many ways. And that what we are seeing is that capitalism can no longer work on its prevailing model that it has developed and elaborated since 1492, a model that says we are going to create islands of cash exploitation and production in these oceans of what I call accumulation by appropriation. That is, the extra economic, through force, through law, through empires, through science, and all of these other processes that essentially map and quantify and secure sources of unpaid work. We tend to think of capitalism as all about generalizing the money relation, which it tendentially does, but it only survives because there are clear limits to that, and there are a number of activities, centrally the work of care in human life, that are kept off the books. Well, now, through struggles, And I'm thinking, and there are people who are going to fill in these stories much better than I. The occupations and the blockades and the labor unrest and all the forms of mass disobedience and revolt that we see both explicitly and simmering under the surface, that these too are part of the challenges of capital's rule. That when we talk about the exhaustion of capital as a system of cheap nature, we're not talking about some abstract structural breakdown. We are talking about how capital works and how capital sees the world and how it generates forces that are internal to it, that are increasingly challenging it and saying that business as usual is no longer acceptable. And here is a parallel, not with the 18th century, but with the 14th century, when peasants and workers said, we refuse to accept the reimposition of the most repressive and antiquated forms of feudal rule that had existed, because for centuries serfdom had been transformed into money rents. So what we're seeing today is the return of violent and repressive and hierarchical and authoritarian modes. We are looking at a world of, certainly in the world of labor history, at a return to the era of pre-1848. But I think that there are corollaries across the spectrum of social life and social revolt. So we need to look at work, and of course, as I've been arguing, that the work that makes capitalism go has always been more than human. It's a tripartite division of work. The smallest part within the cash nexus, but the rest, the unpaid work of human and extra-human nature, outside the cash nexus, but which must be dominated to allow its energies to flow into the vortex of accumulation. And so it's on the train of work and what I've called work energy and its specific organization in capitalism that gives us a hopeful vantage point, one of many possible, I'm sure, to talk about limits, to understand that the limits are indeed outside and inside, and how are they connected? How are they connected, and how are they also deeply fragile? And I think that there's entirely too much faith in capitalism's resilience in an era where the sources of its resilience, that is, the frontiers of cheap nature, are now entirely gone, and not only entirely gone, but climate change is imploding that model. Climate change is not only stopping the frontier, but dramatically creating conditions under which the costs of doing business will seriously and radically emerge. So I am convinced, as I'm sure you know by now, that the dualism of nature-society that the Anthropocene discourse gives us, are humans overwhelming the great forces of nature, that these dualisms can't get us to the heart of the nature of the limits that we face, or help us with the nature of the political challenges that we need to develop, because the dualisms are part of the problem. So this does not mean, if we say humans are a part of nature, that doesn't mean we give up being a distinction. In fact, I would say that we can understand the difference of class, race, gender, state, culture, all the rest of this, by understanding that each of these moments doesn't simply operate in nature, is part of the web of life, that these are processes that have made environments but are also produced by nature as a whole. This gets us out of that false Hobson's choice of environmental determinism, social constructionism. Please, let's not go back to that. And for critics who would rehearse that critique in this era, I think it is a grave disservice to what's going on. So, what do we need to do to do this? I think the core of my argument, and we have this title, great title to this conference, is the Capitalocene. Well, what's the Capitalocene? It's not capitalism as an economic and social system. I think that we need to understand that Capitalocene doesn't challenge the geological Anthropocene. It's not a contest over which stratigraphic signals matter the most. It is a way of saying that it is a way of critiquing both the popular Anthropocene, but also the economistic rendering of capitalism from many radicals, to show that capitalism is a social system in the web of life. It is a producer of the web of life. It is also an ongoing product of the web of life. And the mirage of modern Prometheanism that comes from the long 16th century with Bacon and Descartes, Descartes saying we must make ourselves the masters and possessors of nature, that illusion is now coming rapidly unraveled, and it calls for a a radical political response in the present, but also, and necessary, I think, to that political response is a deep and thoroughgoing understanding of historical understanding and reconstruction of how capitalism has dealt with limits and how it is different today. And so, whether or not this exhaustion of cheap nature as a model leads to something better or worse, well, that remains to be seen. I think that the fear and catastrophism that have permeated green politics and too much environmental thought will not produce the clarity that we need. I think that it's in such periods of civilizational, of what I've called epical crisis, an epical crisis of capitalism as a world ecology, that such intellectual clarity, such historical groundedness is most needed and most influential. In such moments, ideas, too, can become material forces. Thank you.